Thank you very much, Chairman Wani, and to KIIR and Dr. Gupta for this opportunity to speak today, along with these distinguished panelists. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Before I give my remarks, I want to be clear that I do not speak for Kashmiris. I am not a Kashmiri. These are my own, and while based on numerous conversations with Kashmiris and experiences in Kashmir, I cannot speak for them. I'm incredibly privileged to have this platform to speak about the ongoing human rights abuses in Kashmir, and inshallah, I will do it justice. So I'm here today not as a regional expert, but as a deeply concerned and disturbed American citizen who has witnessed the ongoing human rights abuses in Kashmir firsthand since I started visiting the region back in 2016, shortly before the unrest following freedom fighter Burhan Wani's assassination, to present-day abuses following the unconstitutional removal of Article 370 on August 5th by the BJP government back in 2019. As we all know, the world has been largely silent on the Kashmir issue for many years. And while there has been increased interest on the international stage, including a US congressional hearing back in 2019, it is nowhere near enough. Now there is a clear ethnic cleansing of Kashmiris occurring, a process that has been carefully planned and executed by Modi's BJP government, which is backed by the fascist RSS regime. It is beyond unacceptable that the world has continued to sit idly by and let it occur. So I want to bring a personal narrative to this conversation because I think often we get so caught up in the politics of the conflict and the differing opinions that we lose sight of the real lives of Kashmiris that are affected day in and day out by this conflict. As previously mentioned, I started visiting Indian-occupied Kashmir in 2016. At the time, I was a graduate student studying international politics and human rights in Scotland, and I met a Kashmiri girl in my program who invited me to visit her in Kashmir, and I wanted to learn about the conflict. And witnessing the situation on the ground was a profound experience. What triggered my desire to then work on Kashmir and become an activist for the Kashmiri people was one particular experience where I was in a car with my now husband, and I was dressed in traditional Kashmiri clothing, so it was not clear that I was a foreigner. And there was an army truck in front of us, and there were two soldiers on the back, and they pointed their guns at us as we were driving and doing nothing wrong, just simply driving from point A to point B. And I exclaimed to my now husband that I was terrified, that I couldn't believe that this was happening. And for him, he said, "Oh, that's nothing." And I was shocked. As a Westerner, I was completely appalled that that was his reaction to this clear intimidation tactic, this fear that I hadn't experienced before that he was so used to. And I suppose he was used to it because for his whole life, he had been living in conflict. He experienced an IED explosion next to his school as a teenager, and he has experienced seeing the remnants of bodies as a result of this conflict. So I think we all need to put ourselves in the shoes of Kashmiris for a minute who have endured this level of fear, trauma, and loss for years. The psychological impact is unimaginable, and the ability to live freely tattered. Following the removal of Article 370, Modi's BJP government imposed a severe lockdown and communication blackout. No Wi-Fi, no data, no phone lines. It is no secret that this occurred to an extreme level. No matter how much some will try to deny the amount of human rights abuses that transpired, the 2019 US congressional hearing revealed the truth. And I just want to share what I experienced following this removal, now being married to a Kashmiri. We were unable to reach our loved ones in Kashmir for weeks. My aunt-in-law is also a politician in Kashmir, and she was placed under house arrest despite no crimes for over a year. I think we all know what it's like to be confined to your home due to COVID and the psychological impact that can cause. Over the course of several weeks following the communications blackout, I actually worked directly with Kashmiris to try to connect them with their loved ones overseas, given my contacts. This was an excruciating process because I had to connect with Kashmiris overseas first, who then connected with Kashmiris based in India, who then had to physically travel to the region, travel to the villages where Kashmiris were. Then those individuals would have to travel hours to a police station just to have access to a satellite phone to call their loved ones to let them know that they were okay for maybe just a minute or two. During this time, I also received countless testimonies from Kashmiris that the Indian Army in Kashmir was refusing to allow Kashmiris the ability to travel to the hospital for medical care or to receive medication. One woman in particular stated that her father was having heart attack-like symptoms, and when they tried to bring him to the hospital, they were turned away. Another shared that they were unable to refill critical medical prescriptions, which resulted in Kashmiris based in Delhi bringing medical supplies and traveling to Kashmir to disseminate them to people in need. Relatives were not even aware that loved ones had passed away overseas as they were unable to connect with one another. And the youth in particular have been severely impacted by this issue because they have been unable to receive a proper education due to the restrictions imposed and lack of internet. I've heard from numerous students that are suffering from severe mental issues, depression, anxiety, because they have been unable to complete their degrees due to these disruptions. The Indian government continues to impose inhumane restrictions and immense brutality on Kashmiris. They have suffocated the region with hundreds of thousands of troops, making it the most militarized zone in the world, like Mr. Hussain mentioned. And I want to clearly outline some of the human rights abuses that have occurred for decades and worsened, because I think it's really important for the international community to understand, and for those that are not familiar with the conflict that are listening here today. So here in the US, Trump talks about fake news. Well, the Indian government loves fake encounters where Kashmiris are falsely claimed to be militants and killed, which have recently increased. We know this has been going on for years. Disappearances of Kashmiris, leaving many women as half-widows and mothers childless. Pelleting of peaceful Kashmiri protesters, leaving many permanently blinded and injured. Mass rapes of women and girls. Torture of imprisoned Kashmiris, stories of which I shudder to even think of repeating due to the brutality. No freedom of press, as Mr. Hussain has mentioned. Curfews, lockdowns, I have experienced them myself endlessly in Kashmir. Crippling the economy, leading to widespread poverty, communications restrictions, as mentioned above, and surveillance. No foreign media and activists following August 5th, despite attempts to visit the region and examine the situation on the ground. We know that there were, I believe there was a US congressman that tried to go and was turned away. Attempts to silence US members of Congress who have spoken about the human rights abuses, most notably Indian American Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Countless activists that have had their social media pages about the conflict removed, and I suppose it's only a matter of time before mine is as well. A new bill that has passed that now allows Indians to buy land in Kashmir, which is furthering the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiris by forcing them out of their own homes. Fear psychosis techniques. I think one example is the braid choppers. If anybody remembers that occurred, where Indian agents were going around cutting off women's hair, instilling this mass hysteria where women were confined to their homes and fearful to leave. I think this is an example of the distractions that the Indians try to instill on Kashmiris to prevent them from mobilizing about the cause. And then, of course, other disinformation tactics. We saw a recent report that came out about all the tactics India has been using to cause distrust about Pakistan and further distract Kashmiris. So again, I wanted to list these all very clearly because I think it's imperative for the international community to understand the severity of the situation. So what's next? As we all know, Kashmiris have been traumatized for years and are eager for a normal way of life. They are fearful for their lives. It has certainly been more difficult to mobilize in protest due to the increased military presence, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which has further strained the region. But protests are essential in sending a message to the international community that all is not well in Kashmir. Kashmiris already struggle to have a voice, and to remain voiceless in their own home has unfortunate repercussions for the cause. Moreover, Kashmiris that I have spoken to think that the turnout in the recent elections, instead of boycotting them, are because some voters are swayed by the candidates that say that they will work toward restoring Article 370 and 35A and will provide economic solutions to their dire living circumstances, but they did not vote because they accept India's occupation. But as a result of that, the BJP government has been able to portray that all is well in Kashmir and that democracy has prevailed. And therefore, the international community is less likely to intervene in these ongoing human rights abuses. Unfortunately, we are losing momentum as a result, and that needs to be restored in order to hold Modi's regime accountable and firmly address the human rights abuses. I will say that Kashmiris have to take hold of what they want for their future and put it in their hands, and it is really now or never. I have always supported Kashmiris' right to self-determination, and it is ultimately up to them to decide their fate. But what is evident is the gross human rights violations that India has done in Kashmir for decades, and the international community will likely not engage if Kashmiris are to speak on the ground, because it unfortunately implies compliance. I also think that there is a unique and paramount opportunity under the forthcoming Biden administration to address the Kashmir conflict, particularly by working with Pakistan. Pakistan has been increasing their diplomatic efforts broadly on Kashmir and should certainly continue. We cannot forget Prime Minister Imran Khan's profound speech at the United Nations in 2019 that helped elevate the Kashmir issue globally, among other ongoing efforts. I have personally attended several events at the Pakistan Embassy here in Washington, D.C., aimed at raising awareness about the issue, and I am very grateful for their work and genuine concerns for the Kashmiri people. I encourage Pakistan to keep up its efforts, to work closely with the Biden administration, and to most importantly, continue to listen to Kashmiri voices directly and in order to best work together and establish transparency. I believe that this is key to a path forward. India is not willing to sit at the table. They have shown us that again and again, and we must pursue other avenues at this time to save Kashmiri lives. So to conclude, as I know I've probably spoken way too much, I'd like to share a quote that I think is an important reminder for us all. Kashmir is a place of love and resistance, end quote. We cannot give up the fight. Thank you very much.